The laughter was sharp and ugly, cutting through the reverent silence of the memorial. The security guards were laughing at the old veteran, specifically at his faded, battered hat. It was a pathetic sight, really, but the mockery curdled in their throats, freezing on their lips the moment the old man spoke. He said 2 words, "Ghost Falcon." And suddenly, every soldier within earshot, active duty or retired, snapped to rigid attention, their bodies locked, their faces carved from stone. The laughter, you see, had died instantly. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it, and comment where you're watching from. You have to picture the scene. It was Arlington. You know the place even if you've only seen it in pictures. It's a place that smells of history, of cut grass, and of something deeper, something like sacrifice. The air that day, a crisp Tuesday in early November, carried a chill that promised winter was just around the corner. The sky was a sharp, unforgiving blue, and the white marble of the headstones stretched out like teeth, perfect and endless. The silence there is a sound. It's the sound of footsteps on pavement, the distant rhythmic crack of the ceremonial guard at the tomb of the unknown, the rustle of wind in the ancient oaks. It's a silence that demands respect. And into this silence came Charles. He didn't arrive in a polished black car or with a grieving family. He came on the 10:30 a.m. city bus, stepping down slowly, his right knee stiff, his left hand gripping the rail until his knuckles were as white as the marble he'd come to see. He was, by all appearances, a man who had been worn down by time. His coat was thin, a simple gray wool that had seen better decades. His shoes were scuffed but clean. He clutched a single, simple white daisy, the kind you buy for a few dollars at a corner market, its petals already starting to look tired from the journey. He was anonymous, invisible. He looked like exactly what he was, an old man, alone, coming to visit the dead. And on his head he wore the hat. It wasn't a crisp new baseball cap emblazoned with Vietnam Veteran or OEF Veteran. It was an old olive drab boonie hat, the kind soldiers wear in the field. It was faded by a sun that hadn't shone on America, stained with sweat and time, and washed so many times it was soft as old cotton, the brim drooping limply around his face. It looked, to the untrained eye, like something he might have picked up at a surplus store for $1. At the main gate, where visitors are funneled through metal detectors and security checkpoints, sat Jake and Joseph. They weren't soldiers. They were contractors, hired for security. Jake was young, maybe 25, with a physique that came from a gym, not from the field. He wore his uniform with a practiced arrogance, his sunglasses perched on his short-cropped hair, even though he was standing in the shade. Joseph was older, heavier, a man who just wanted to get through his shift. Jake was bored, and bored security guards, you'll find, are often cruel. He saw Charles shuffling forward, the daisy, the limp, the hat. Jake nudged Joseph, a smirk playing on his lips. He probably muttered something like, "Get a load of this one," or forgot his carer. As Charles approached, Jake held up a hand, stopping him. The gesture was unnecessarily aggressive, a display of minor power. "Hold on, Pops. Empty your pockets into the tray." His voice was loud, echoing slightly, designed to draw attention, to make himself the center of this small, temporary world. Charles did as he was told, his movement slow, placing a worn leather wallet, a set of keys, and some loose change into the gray plastic tray. He didn't make eye contact. He just wanted to pass. He just wanted to get to Section 60. Jake wasn't finished. The metal detector beeped, as it always does with old men who have buckles and bits of metal they've forgotten about. Charles shuffled through, and Jake held up the detector wand, running it over the old man's body with exaggerated slowness. "What's all this, Granddad? Smuggling in spare parts?" Jake chuckled at his own joke. Joseph, behind the X-ray machine, offered a weak, obligatory laugh. Charles stood patiently, his eyes fixed on a point far beyond the security checkpoint, as if he could already see the rows of stone. He said nothing, his silence seeming to irritate Jake even more. The guard wanted a reaction. He wanted fear or anger, or at least some kind of sputtering defense. He was getting nothing but quiet dignity, and it felt like disrespect. "I said," Jake pushed, his voice hardening, "what's with all the metal? Got a pacemaker in there? Or just rusty joints?" This time, Charles's eyes met his. They were a pale, watery blue, but there was a depth in them. a tiredness that wasn't just physical. "My knee," Charles said, his voice quiet, gravelly. "It sings when the weather turns." He gestured to his right leg. "Had it since '73. This was an opening, a small offering of his history, but Jake didn't see it as history, he saw it as a punchline. 73, huh? Must have been a rough year for falling downstairs. He tapped the wand on Charles's hip. "You're clear. Now what's the deal with the hat?" Charles reached for his wallet and keys, securing them in his old coat. "It's just my hat." "Not just a hat," Jake insisted, stepping in front of Charles, blocking his path. Now he had an audience. A small line of tourists, a young family, and standing off to the side, 3 active-duty Marines in their immaculate dress blues were all watching. The Marines, you could tell, were waiting for a wreath-laying ceremony, standing with that perfect, rigid posture that makes them look like they were carved from the same marble as the monuments. "This is Arlington National Cemetery, sir. It's a place of respect. We have a dress code." Jake tapped the brim of the boonie hat, his finger flicking it disrespectfully. "And this thing looks like you found it in a sewer. It's disrespectful." Joseph looked uncomfortable now. He shuffled his feet, avoiding eye contact, wishing Jake would just let the old man go. But Jake was puffing up, performing for the Marines, showing them how he, too, was a guardian of this place. He was in charge. He was the authority. He was protecting the sanctity of the memorial from a bum, a relic, a nobody who couldn't even be bothered to wear a clean hat. The accusation hung in the air, thick and foul, disrespectful. You could see the word land on Charles. It was a physical blow. Disrespectful. He, of all people, in this, of all places. His hand, the one holding the daisy, trembled just slightly. His shoulders, which had been stooped with age and weariness, slumped another inch. He looked at the ground. I'm not being disrespectful. This hat. It's the only one I wear for this." His voice was so low Jake had to lean in, which only fueled his condescension. "The only one you wear for what? Raking leaves? Begging for change?" The tourists winced. The father in the line quietly pulled his son closer. But the Marines, their faces didn't change. They didn't move. They just watched, their eyes cold and analytical, assessing the scene. They were trained observers, and they were observing a man being systematically humiliated. Charles shook his head, a small, pained movement. "I'm just here to see my friends," he whispered. "Section 60, row 14. He tried to step around Jake, a quiet plea to be left alone. But Jake, committed to his power trip, put a flat hand on Charles's thin chest, stopping him. Not a hard shove, not enough to be assault, but a firm, definitive block. "I don't think so. I told you the hat comes off, or you don't come in. Final warning, old man. Show some damn respect. Take it off." The air crackled. This was the precipice. Charles looked down at the hand on his chest, then up at Jake's smug face. He looked at Joseph, who was now desperately shaking his head at Jake, trying to signal stop. He looked over at the 3 Marines who were still as statues, their gaze locked on him. And then something changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. It was perhaps the most terrifying thing you could witness. The frailty evaporated. It was like watching a mist burn off a mountain, revealing the solid granite beneath. Charles's back straightened. The slump was gone. The watery uncertainty in his pale blue eyes solidified, clearing into a gaze so sharp, so penetrating, it made Jake instinctively pull his hand back. The man who stood before them was no longer a frail, shuffling old man. The man who stood before them was someone else entirely. He was someone who had given orders and watched them be obeyed. He was someone who had seen the inside of the abyss. His voice, when it came, was no longer a gravelly whisper. It was quiet, yes, but it cut through the air with the sharp, cold edge of a bayonet. "You," he said, not asking, but stating, "will remove your hand." He didn't wait for Jake to comply. He simply looked at him. And Jake, to his own surprise, found his hand dropping to his side. The atmosphere had shifted. The power had just transferred, silently and absolutely. Jake was blinking, confused. The script had been flipped and he didn't know his lines. He stammered, trying to regain his footing, falling back on the only authority he had. Who the hell do you think you are?" You can't talk to me like that. I'm security." He puffed his chest back out, but it was a hollow gesture. The old man, Charles, didn't even seem to hear him. He was looking past Jake, his gaze now fixed on the three Marines. He was, in a way, addressing them, not the guard who was no longer relevant. He was identifying himself as procedure would demand. "My name," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden, deep silence, "is Charles R. Miller." He paused, as if pulling a memory from a deep, cold place. "I am here under Directive 77 Alpha, as a guest of the interred." Jake, now completely lost, scoffed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Directive? What directive? This is a public memorial. You're talking crazy." He turned to Joseph, looking for support. "This old guy's lost his mind, right?" But Joseph was staring at Charles, his face pale. He'd heard something in the old man's tone. Something that wasn't crazy. It was cold. Jake turned back, emboldened by his own voice, ready to escalate this, maybe even call for police. "I asked you who you are, old man. You give me a name. Not some movie line." Charles held Jake's gaze. The pity in his eyes was almost as sharp as the authority. "I am a veteran," he said. "I am here to honor my team." "Your team?" Jake laughed. And this was the laugh from the title, the sharp, ugly one. "What team was that, huh? The bingo team? The shuffleboard brigade?" The disrespect was so profound, so complete, that it hung in the air like poison gas. Charles closed his eyes for just a second. When he opened them, the last bit of warmth was gone. He looked at Jake, at the pavement, at the sky, and then back at the Marines. He spoke not to Jake, but at him. "I was cleared for this site and every site like it, under the designation given to me by United States Special Operations Command." He took a slow breath, and then he said the words. He gave Jake what he wanted. He told him who he was. "My call sign," he said, his voice clear and hard as diamond, "was Ghost Falcon. Ghost Falcon." The words meant nothing to Jake. It was a stupid name, something from a comic book. He actually let out a short, sharp snort. "Ghost what? Is that supposed to mean something?" He was about to follow it with another insult, maybe something about Captain America, but the words died in his throat. He was cut off, not by a voice but by a sound. It was the sound of 3 pairs of leather heels striking marble pavement at the exact same instant. Crack! The sound was as sharp and final as a gunshot. It echoed off the visitor center walls. Jake and Joseph spun around. The 3 Marines who had been standing at ease were now rigid. They were at the most profound, severe, and respectful position of attention Jake had ever seen. Their bodies were ramrod straight, chins tucked, hands flat at their sides, seams of their trousers perfectly aligned. Their eyes were fixed forward, staring at a point just over Charles's head. They looked, Jake thought wildly, like they had just seen a god or a ghost. Joseph, who had been in the Army Reserves for a few years, understood first. His jaw went slack. His face turned the color of ash. "Oh my God," he breathed, a tiny, terrified sound. Jake was still confused. What's going on? Why are they?" He gestured helplessly at the Marines who hadn't so much as blinked. They looked like statues. Statues that were vibrating with tension. "Jake, shut up," Joseph hissed, his voice trembling. Just shut up." The silence that fell over the courtyard was absolute. The tourists had frozen. The family had stopped walking. The wind itself seemed to have paused, holding its breath. All you could hear was the distant, lonely cry of a single bird and the pounding of Jake's own heart in his ears. And then, other soldiers. You started to see them. An older man in a wheelchair, wearing a Korean War cap, struggled to push himself straighter in his seat. 2 Army Rangers, young and hard, walking back from a ceremony, stopped dead in their tracks, their conversation cut short. They too snapped to attention, one by one, every person in that courtyard who was active duty, or who had ever been active duty and understood, stopped what they were doing and stood still. They faced Charles. The courtyard had become a silent, living monument. Jake looked at Charles, then at the Marines, then back at Charles. The old man hadn't moved. He just stood there, the battered boonie hat on his head, the dying daisy in his hand, and he watched the soldiers honor him. The authority hadn't come from him. It had come from what he represented. And Jake, standing there in his cheap sweat-wicking uniform, finally understood that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. You have to understand what that name meant. To you, to me, to Jake, it's nothing. A cool-sounding phrase. But in the places that matter, in the quiet rooms at Langley, in the ready rooms at Fort Bragg, in the hushed archives of military history, Ghost Falcon is a legend. It's not a name you find in a history book. It's not on any public medal citation. It is a name that exists only in redacted files and in the memories of the few men who know the truth. Ghost Falcon was the call sign for the sole survivor of Operation Cindershade, a mission so deep, so dark, and so catastrophically failed that it was buried before the bodies were even cold. Back in '72, a 5-man long-range reconnaissance team was captured deep in hostile territory. They had vital intelligence, the kind that could change the course of a campaign. The mission to extract them was deemed impossible, a suicide run. No air support, no backup, miles of jungle and an entire enemy battalion between them and safety. Ghost Falcon was the man who volunteered. He was the team leader of the unit sent to get them. He went in with 7 men. He came back. Well, he didn't come back. He was listed as missing in action, presumed dead, along with his entire team and the men they were trying to save. But the legend says he didn't die. It says he fought for 3 weeks, alone. That he evaded capture, that he inflicted so much damage on the enemy forces that they diverted 2 entire regiments to hunt 1 man, a single ghost, who moved without sound and struck without warning. The intelligence he'd been sent to retrieve? It made it back. Tucked into the boot of a wounded pilot he'd saved from another downed aircraft weeks later, but Ghost Falcon himself was swallowed by the jungle. The file was closed. He was declared dead, his name etched onto a black wall in Washington, a name among thousands. But in the special operations community, the story was passed down. It became a benchmark for courage, for sacrifice, for the impossible. And the men who trained the new generations of soldiers, they would end their hardest day of training with the story. "You think this is hard?" they'd say. "You're not Ghost Falcon. You never will be." And now, 50 years later, the ghost himself was standing at the security gate at Arlington, holding a daisy. The silence stretched, becoming heavy, unbearable. Jake was trembling. The color had drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, mottled white. He looked like he was going to throw up. He looked at the hard, perfect posture of the Marines. He looked at the old man in the ridiculous hat. And he saw the hat for what it was. It wasn't a surplus store reject. It was the hat. The one he'd worn. The one that had seen hell. It wasn't a sign of disrespect, it was a relic, it was a shroud. Jake's eyes, wide with panic, met Charles's. He opened his mouth and a pathetic squeak came out. "Sir," he began, his voice cracking. "Sir, I didn't know." His apology was a desperate, grasping thing, aimed not at forgiveness, but at his own survival. He was apologizing to the legend, to the Marines, to the ghosts that suddenly crowded the air around them. Charles just looked at him. He didn't offer forgiveness, he didn't offer anger. He offered nothing. He had not come here for Jake. Jake was an insect, a buzzing fly that had briefly interrupted his pilgrimage. The old veteran turned his gaze from the stammering guard to the 3 Marines. They were still locked at attention, their young faces taut with a mixture of awe and profound, vicarious shame. Charles gave them a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a dismissal, as you were. The Marines as one relaxed but only slightly, their eyes never leaving him. The eldest of them, a sergeant with the hardened look of a man who had already seen his own share of the world, took one respectful step forward. His voice was hoarse. "Sir, permission to provide escort to your destination?" It was the ultimate offer of respect. A formal guard of honor from the new generation to one of the originals. Charles looked at the sergeant, at the 2 young corporals beside him. He saw their strength, their youth, their immaculate uniforms, and he saw the ghosts he'd come to visit, the men in Section 60, who would never be young or old again. A flicker of something, sadness, pride, crossed his face. He shook his head just once, a tiny movement. "Thank you, Sergeant," he whispered, his voice back to its gravelly quiet. "But you guard the living. I'm just here to visit the dead." The sergeant swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He snapped his head in a sharp nod. "Understood, sir." He and his men stepped back, clearing the path, forming an impromptu honor guard. Charles turned his back on them all. He turned his back on the stammering, terrified Jake, who was being physically supported by an equally pale Joseph. He turned his back on the silent, watching tourists. He turned his back on the young Marines. He faced the cemetery, the endless rows of white, and he began to walk. His limp seemed more pronounced now, as if the armor of Ghost Falcon had receded, leaving just Charles behind. He shuffled past the security station, his scuffed shoes quiet on the pavement. Jake and Joseph didn't just move out of his way. They practically flattened themselves against the wall of the guard booth as if afraid to even cast a shadow on him. They didn't exist. He walked past them, the daisy held in his left hand, his right hand steady at his side. As he cleared the checkpoint and stepped onto the main thoroughfare, something else happened. The crowd, they parted. It was like the Red Sea. The tourists, the families, the other visitors, they simply stepped aside, clearing a path for him. Their own conversations dying, their faces filled with a confusing mixture of curiosity and a respect they didn't fully understand. They just knew they were seeing something. They knew the air had changed. The only sound was the click-clack of Charles's shoes on the path and the distant, constant rhythm of the ceremonial guard. He walked alone, a small, gray figure against the vast green and white. He didn't look left or right. His eyes were fixed on his destination. Section 60. He walked past a high-ranking officer, a full-bird colonel, who was talking with a civilian dignitary. The colonel saw the Marines at the gate, saw the path parting, and then he saw Charles. He saw the hat. And the colonel, a man who commanded thousands, a man who hadn't stood at attention for anyone less than a general in years, stopped his conversation mid-sentence, and he saluted. Not a casual, dismissive salute, but a sharp, parade ground salute, his hand cutting the air, his back rigid. He held it as Charles passed. Charles, in response, didn't salute back. He simply brought his left hand, the one holding the daisy, up to his chest just for a moment, a small tap over his heart. It was an acknowledgement, a shared understanding, and then he continued on. He had a long walk ahead of him. He had friends to see. You see, the story isn't really about Jake. Jake is just collateral damage. He's the loud, ugly noise that proved how deep the silence could be. No, the story is about the hat. It's about the daisy. It's about the difference between looking respectful and being respectful. Jake, in his crisp uniform, standing at the gates of the nation's most sacred ground, was the one who was disrespectful. He was guarding the place, but he didn't understand the meaning. Charles, in his dirty, faded hat and thin coat, was the meaning. He was a living, breathing piece of that hallowed ground. He was a monument walking, carrying with him the ghosts of men whose names were carved just yards away. The hat. That hat was his uniform. It was his flag. It was the only thing he had that had been there with them. To ask him to take it off wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was an act of desecration. It was asking him to shed his history, to deny his brothers, to pretend he was just another tourist. It was a request he was incapable of fulfilling. The hat stayed because the hat belonged there, perhaps more than any of them. It had been earned. It was paid for in blood, and terror, and survival. It was a crown in its own way, worn by a king of a terrible hidden country. And as Charles walked deeper into the cemetery, leaving the commotion and the shame behind him, the silence of Arlington settled back in. But it was a different silence. It was heavier. It was charged. The tourists started to whisper, asking each other what had happened, who that man was. The Marines at the gate finally, slowly, relaxed. But they didn't speak. They just watched him go until he was a small speck in the distance. Jake was leaning against the wall, his head in his hands. He would, you can be sure, be looking for a new job by tomorrow. His career as a guardian of respect was over. Joseph was already on the radio, his voice shaky, probably calling his supervisor to try and explain the unexplainable. To try and describe how they had, for a few terrible minutes, insulted a ghost, and the ghost himself, he just kept walking, one slow step at a time toward row 14, ready to finally deliver his flower. He finally reached section 60. This part of Arlington isn't like the old sections. It doesn't have the grand trees or the sweeping hills. It's newer. It's flatter. It's rawer. This is the section for the wars you see on the news. Iraq, Afghanistan. The graves are fresh, the earth still settling, but the men Charles was visiting, they weren't from these wars, they were from his. They had been moved here, consolidated after their files were finally declassified, their stories allowed to be told, at least to their families. They were the men from Cindershade, his team, the ones who didn't come back. He stopped in front of a row of 5 identical white stones. They were perfectly aligned. Anderson, Baker, Chen, Diaz, Smith. He knew them. He didn't see the names. He saw their faces. He saw Anderson, who was always chewing on an unlit cigar. He saw Chen, who was quiet and read philosophy books in the middle of the jungle. He saw Diaz, who had a picture of his baby girl, a girl who was now a middle-aged woman, taped to the inside of his helmet. He saw them all. He stood there for a long time. The wind picked up, rustling the brim of his hat. He didn't cry. You get the feeling he'd run out of tears for this decades ago. He just stood, and he remembered. He remembered the sound of the rain. He remembered the smell of cordite and mud. He remembered the fear and the impossible, desperate courage. He was paying his respects, not just with a flower, but with his presence. He was bearing witness. He was the only one left who could. He was the ghost, and these were his anchors to the world. Finally, with his stiff knee protesting, he knelt. It was a slow, painful process. He placed the single white daisy in the soft grass, right in the center, equidistant from all 5 graves. He touched the top of the center stone, his fingers tracing the name. He whispered something, you couldn't hear it. It wasn't for you. It wasn't for anyone but them. It was probably a hello, or maybe it was a goodbye, or maybe it was just, I'm sorry. He stayed there, kneeling on the cold earth, a lone guardian in a faded hat, while the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows over the field of stone. His dignity was, and had always been, perfectly intact.